I'm Dr. Gabrielle Orsi, Project Manager with the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Family Work Demands and Responsibilities, presented by Dr. Kira Mauseth. Just a few quick words about our center. We provide free training and technical assistance to behavioral health and primary care providers, as well as school and social service staff whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals with or at risk of developing serious mental illness. We serve SAMHSA's Region 10, which is Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We focus on evidence-based practices for mental health issues such as psychosis, but we do provide free training on a variety of topics, including suicide prevention, integrated care, diversity, equity issues, school mental health, peer support, trauma-informed approaches, and more. Just a busy slide here showing all the different kinds of things we do, as well as our smiling faces of our co-directors, Christina Clayton and Lydia Schwastiak. We invite you to follow us on social media, as well as subscribe to our newsletter and visit our website to keep in touch with us and learn about what we're doing. Just a quick land acknowledgement that we are located on the land that traditionally has been in the stewardship of the Snohomish and Coast Salish peoples. We are grateful to them for their stewardship past and present of this land. Finally, just a quick note about language. It's our intention to always be mindful of using language that promotes recovery, is culturally appropriate, and demonstrates respect for a person's dignity and worth. We also would just take a moment to say that if you're sharing something about clients, this session is being recorded, so watch out for any confidential details that you're sharing. And your feedback is important, so we'll be sharing an evaluation survey with you towards the end of this session in the chat. We've got staff monitoring the chat to answer your questions about technical issues, whatever else may come up. We're going to hopefully have some time at the end for questions, so feel free to put your questions about the subject of today's presentation in the chat as well. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kira Mauseth. She's a practicing clinical psychologist. She also teaches as a senior instructor at Seattle University, and she's a co-lead for the Behavioral Health Strike Team for the Washington State Department of Health. Her work and research interests include resilience, trauma, and disaster behavioral health, and she's worked extensively overseas in various different zones that have faced crises, from Haiti to Jordan to Syria and more. So it's my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Mauseth. And I think at this point we were going to conduct a poll. Is that right? Just to get a sense of who's in the audience today. So this will be a quick 2-question poll. If you have a lot of trouble with it, you're welcome to type your answer in the chat. Or if, unfortunately, your answer was other, you're also welcome to share your role or your answer in the chat.
Thanks, everybody, for completing the poll. While we do that, I'm going to go ahead and pull my slide deck up and get ready to go. As Gabrielle mentioned, it's really easy and convenient for me, to keep an eye on the chat. And so I appreciate if there are questions or content areas that you'd like a little bit more detail about, please don't hesitate to ask things specifically or request additional clarification. That's something that I'm happy to provide, because I want to make sure that you get out of it what you'd like. As we're waiting for the poll results to get completed, I just want to also say that all of the things that I'm talking about today are designed to give you additional context and some more information that is potentially helpful. I'm not here to give you more stuff to do. I know that all of us who are working in healthcare in general, or teaching or education, in the variety of different workplace settings that I'm seeing come up on the poll here, especially in the context of what we've all experienced over the last year, that people don't have energy right now. Most of us are very low energy. So nothing in this presentation is designed to say, okay, here's a whole bunch more stuff for your list to go do with your family or with the folks that you support. So I'm hoping that that's a that's a good takeaway, and that you have some little tidbits, like just a few things that might be relevant or applicable in your day-to-day lives that are helpful.
Great. So it looks like almost everybody has voted. So I'm going to go ahead and share out those results.
Great. Okay.
We've got
Education's great.
25% of folks saying they're a behavioral health clinician or therapist, 25% saying that they are a case manager or outreach worker, a lot of people, 21%, working in education, school-based organization,
Great.
and then a variety of workplace settings.
I'm hoping that the educational piece will be helpful, because there is a section in the talk today about the back to classroom transition that a lot of us are sort of trying to navigate. And there's a lot of anxiety, I think, excitement and anxiety, kind of on a spectrum, about how that's going to go. So I have a little bit to share, I think, about that today.
Great.
Could we do the next one? Yeah.
Let's go on and ask folks about the poll regarding your caregiving responsibilities. And again, if you have any difficulty with the poll, feel free to type your answer in the chat or expand on your answer in the chat.
Great. This is helpful. Thanks for being patient with us. As we're waiting for that to complete, I just want to give you a sense of the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of large scale context of the disaster that we've experienced and what that means for the next few months moving forward. I'm going to talk about the neurological responses that are normal for kids to have right now, and really people of all ages, but I'm going to kind of break it down developmentally for folks under 18 and then for those over 18. And then talk about some of the transitions that I was mentioning, sort of the back to school stuff and what we can do to communicate effectively, to really understand the various concerns, because they are becoming more and more disparate. Some folks are more excited and more happy, and kids too, and some folks are really, really concerned about what the next 6 months is going to include, and sort of establishing the new normal for children and for students, as well as for ourselves and for patients as well. So there's all kinds of nuances in how we go about doing that, and that's part of what I'm going to be talking about today. Does it look like we're about done there, Gabrielle?
Mm-hmm. Right, so I'm going to share out the results now about caregiving responsibilities. 27% care for children ages 0 to 5, 23% care for children ages 6 to 12, 45% care for children ages 12 to 18, and then 41% care for other folks, not children.
Great. Thank you so much. That's really helpful information for me to have. I'm, as a clinician, as a clinical psychologist, my practice specializes in working with teenagers and adults. So I work with and therapeutically work with kids from 13 and up, and people 13 and up. So I have a lot of experience with teenagers specifically. And then as a mother, I have a 3-year-old, a newly minted 3-year-old. He just turned 3 2 weeks ago, and a 5-year-old as well. So I'm hoping that some of the examples that I can provide in those areas also will be relevant to you. Okay, I'm just going to jump in. Thanks so much. Some of you have probably already seen this chart before. I'm going to try to move quickly through it so we can get into the caregiving stuff a little bit. But where we are in this disaster response and recovery cycle is right here between months sort of 12 and 13. And what we are seeing, and it's clearly reflected in the data, not just in Washington State, but all over the country, that there is becoming a split in the behavioral health symptoms and experience that people are having. And not coincidentally for this talk today, one of the groups that we are most concerned about are people in the sort of 22 and under demographic age category. And yes, that's a huge category, but we're seeing some alarming numbers in terms of suicidal thinking, suicidal behavior, just anxiety and depression kind of in general. And it seems to be particularly manifesting in young adults, teenagers, and adolescents. So as we move forward, what we're going to see, and this is not just reflected by an age demographic too, but people's experience of the last 12 months can fairly accurately predict where on this pattern someone is based on the kinds of resource availability that folks have, economic security, maybe food insecurity, unemployment, or stable employment. And the trajectory moving forward is going to vary dramatically, more so than it has over the last 9 months. So you may have heard the phrase "same storm, different boats." that we're all in this pandemic together, but people have very different experiences of it. That discrepancy is going to become larger as we move forward. There's a lot of hope and there's a lot of optimism in some communities and some families, and for other families who are experiencing social marginalization or discrimination, or have had other additional setbacks, maybe of an economic variety. That's a different trajectory. So there are age considerations, there are economic and social considerations as well that can kind of indicate what part of the pattern people are experiencing right now. So here's where we are, and that's where we're going. But I will say this, that the bottom line for how people do with disasters is that the vast majority of folks return to their baseline level of functioning at some point in the very near future after a disaster. Usually it's within 18 to 24 months, which might feel like a long time, but a lot of time has already passed with that in this cycle. So resilience is the most common outcome to any disaster. A little bit about what's going on neurologically. I really like to share this slide because it helps us understand why we're struggling the way we are. And this applies directly to kids and adults. So the limbic system is the part of the brain that's responsible for all the emotional processing. And that part is exhausted because it's been on high alert for such a long period of time. One of the things that happens when our limbic system is basically compromised is that we tend to react impulsively, we tend to react emotionally, and our brain doesn't get a chance to integrate itself in the way that it filters responses to things. That pattern of behavior is magnified for kids under 20 years old until the prefrontal cortex has been fully developed, which includes all teenagers and adolescents. So the prefrontal cortex, right, the job of that part of the brain is to help us plan and track and organize, and to an extent, filter our emotional responses by using logic and saying, yeah, that doesn't quite make sense in this circumstance. So when the prefrontal cortex is kind of offline, which it is for most of us right now, even healthy adults, then it is even more compromised to an extent for people whose prefrontal cortex is not even completely developed yet, just biologically. The consequences of that are that teenagers and adolescents and kids are having a potentially an exceptionally difficult time navigating the consequences of the disaster, particularly in terms of the schedule getting all upset, what the routine is like at home. We are really, really struggling with managing that. And on the adult side, even assuming that neurologically everything is kind of where it should be and operating correctly, people still are really struggling. And I mean, myself included, right? It's really hard to remember anything right now. Memory is compromised, organization, focus, like starting to write an email and then getting distracted and doing something else. And most adults right now across the United States feel like they have symptoms associated with ADHD or early onset dementia. That makes it incredibly challenging to consider how we're doing as caregivers and not judge ourselves and feel like we're not dropping the ball all over the place just because things are so unorganized. Our brains are responding in a very, very normal way to where we are in the disaster cycle. And so understanding, that that's happening on a very basic neurological level, hopefully will help take some pressure off of all of us, so that we recognize, this struggle is sort of a universally shared thing. It is made worse by other different challenging conditions that some folks are experiencing. And for kids, and again, people under 20 in terms of the prefrontal cortex, they're already managing their neurological sort of perceptions of things from that place of not as quite as strong a sense of consequence of things or causal results. So if I act in this impulsive kind of way, the sense of consequence is not something that is experienced to the same degree, obviously, for a teenager as it would be for somebody in their mid-20s or even older. So all of these neurological things are playing out in how we interact day to day, for sure. So this is something that I've also shared before. These are common responses that adults have. The trouble sleeping is really incredibly common right now. Aggression, acting out, sort of snapping, snacking on stuff. I made this joke, I think, last week when I was doing a different presentation, but I had a client tell me recently that she had decided to wear her mask inside her home, not because of COVID, but to stop herself from snacking all the time. So the eating carbs and the stress eating is a really, really common thing right now. Okay, this slide is about common responses that kids have. So this is generally, in terms of data, it's about people that are under 18, but not exclusively. It's just like sort of that age range in general. And how it's going to show up is different depending on where people are in the developmental spectrum. Like, so for kids from 0 to 5, separation anxiety is a much bigger issue than it is for a teenager. But if a teenager is really anxious, you could see some regression there where they might really, want to be at home in their room, in their known environment for sure. The same cognitive issues that affect adults affect kids too, including how we learn, right? So sitting in front of a computer trying to learn the new math or whatever it is incredibly challenging because our brains are all compromised to a certain extent right now. It's also very normal for kids to have sleep disturbance and to be manifesting their anxiety to the extent that they have it in physical complaints. So headaches and stomach aches are common, not just for adults, but also for kids as well. Behaviorally, kids are fairly predictable, just like adults are. We tend to either act out or act in. And acting out is when we express distress externally. Acting in is when we express distress internally. And kids do the same thing. So that can be being aggressive, kind of tantruming, maybe risk-taking for teenagers and young adults. And younger kids can express distress in the same kind of way, but on their own scale, right? So that could be through play. That could be how they interact with each other. There could be isolation, like intentional isolation, just playing alone. Or there could be a constant need to be around other kids or even being aggressive towards other kids. So those extremes tend to be how we manifest our behavioral concerns, regardless of the age range. There tends to be that spread. Okay. Balancing work and home demands. I'm going to go through a couple different categories here, but I really want to encourage the following. So part of resilience is about figuring out ways to adapt to the circumstances that would have been unrealistic or kind of silly pre-COVID or pre-pandemic. I'm not sure what works for you based on different demands, but consider things that you might not have ever considered before. And it's hard to be creative right now because when our prefrontal cortex isn't really functioning well, we don't think particularly creatively, but that is important. Try out a new schedule, be willing to adapt in ways, again, that you would not have considered. So boundaries and adaptation come hand in glove. They aren't opposed to one another. So what I mean by that is that it's really important to try a new schedule, try a new space, try different ways of having fun, try different ways of, enjoying your family time. Think of new things to do that you hadn't tried before, rather than holding out for it to get back to whatever normal was. We're not going to have fun until we can do X, Y, and Z. That actually, because of the lack of adaptation associated with that, it holds off the ability to have fun and enjoy things. So really trying to creatively adapt your space, your time, your schedule, and your sense of fun right now is part of the resilience mix that's going to bode well over the next couple months. I'm going to come back to this last bit about adjusting expectations, but this is kind of the roadmap for the things that are needed in order to balance these multiple demands that we all are experiencing. Okay. This is about identifying what works for you. I'm not really a fan of the term self-care. I think it's been overused. When someone tells me that I need to work on my self-care, it's really all I can do to not roll my eyes and think, great, I'll have to schedule that in sometime. But what I want to suggest is that each of us needs to come up with just a few things, just a short list of things that make us feel better, whether it's things that take 2 minutes, like listening to a favorite song, or just walking outside and standing outside and just taking a deep breath, or watching a show, taking a shower, whatever. Like there really aren't any wrong answers to this, as long as they're not in the substance use category. But identifying things that have helped get you through really difficult times or bad days before, and also be willing to share and try new things. So any movement that you can do outside or otherwise, stretching, getting up and just moving around just a little bit. I joke about taking laps around my dining room table. Just boop, boop, the little ones want to do that anyway, but physical activity helps integrate all of the sections of our brain that are having trouble communicating right now. So anytime you can do that is gonna be a neurological benefit. So what I'd like to do now briefly is just do some breakout rooms and ask you to share with each other some things that you have tried that work for you. I think it's a great way to sort of pass tips around that are tried in real life, not things that you just find online. But if you can share with each other some of the things that have worked for you before in this regard, to help you balance things, to help you feel sort of grounded, we will do that for just a few minutes in breakout rooms.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back from your breakout. Just waiting for a few more folks to join us from the breakout rooms, and then we'll resume our presentation.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I think I just said it was just bad timing to my group and got whisked back into the main session. I will go ahead and share my slides again. I'm hoping that you were able to share with each other some of the tips that worked. If you had some good ones or heard some great things, please go ahead and add them to the chat, and we can all benefit from your experiences or things that were shared. I just want to reflect that I recognize how really tired people are, and I appreciate you being here and coming here to learn about these things. If you find that you personally are you have a little bit more energy, you're coming from a more optimistic and hopeful place about where we are and heading out of this pandemic, then I really encourage you to share that energy with your coworkers, with your family members, with the folks here participating. But I also want to truly acknowledge that in general, we were talking about it in our breakout room, pandemic apathy is such a real thing, and we're so tired of this that it's really hard to find motivation, and it's hard to find things to get excited about right now. So just just try not to judge that if that's where you are, because it's okay and it's expected. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna move forward. So this bit is about things we can concretely do. Again, take from it whatever might be helpful for you. Our brains, because of the way they're functioning right now in the disaster response and recovery cycle, are our limbic systems are exhausted. They're not perceiving information accurately. Our brains are all, including kids' brains, more likely to perceive neutral information as being threatening or negative right now. We're tuned into threat awareness. So working on sensory engagement and mindfulness, there's lots of different ways you can sort of conceptualize what this is. But on a basic neurological level, the idea is that our sensory neurons and our nerve endings are more powerful and more basic in our brain than the parts of the brain that are responsible for producing anxiety. To be anxious about something requires a level of thought about it, and sensory neurons don't. They operate much more simply than that. Temperature and touch are particularly powerful for people of all ages. If someone that you work with or one of the kiddos that you care for has anxiety, struggles with anxiety, temperature is something that I strongly recommend trying to manipulate. You can put an orange in your freezer, and if someone is anxious or verging on a panic attack, pull that orange out of the freezer and just manipulate it in your hands. Try and peel it, pick at it. The scent of orange is usually a pleasant smell. And it also, manipulating a really cold object in your hands also short circuits that sense of anxiety. It really kind of stops that process in its tracks. You can put both of your hands in a brief ice bath, just fill a little bowl full of ice water and stick your fingers or your hands in there for about 20 seconds. It does the same thing. And again, this works for kids and adults. This is neurologically how we're wired. Mindfulness, if you engage in a practice that's similar to that, or mindfulness or meditation, it really is about letting go of past and future. So the things that have already happened are done and you can't fix, and the things that haven't happened, don't exist yet. So the way that mindfulness helps our brains really step away from those two buckets is by focusing our senses on what's happening in the present moment. Some people have an easier time doing this than others, but it's about, regulating breath so that you don't go into fight or flight mode, and then just noticing all of the aspects of how your body feels in that moment. And just acknowledging the thoughts that are coming into the head and letting them go, acknowledging them again, letting them go, focusing attention back on the present moment. Again, there's so many different ways to do this, many different modalities. But if you can engage your neurons in such a way that help them focus on what is happening right now in front of you, it's going to be really effective in minimizing anxiety. Okay, so there's two things in terms of especially caregiving or parental or even academic communication. The first thing to recognize is that where we want our kids to be and where we want ourselves to be is in the green zone, and we often aren't there. for whatever reason. People are very tired, so they're in the blue zone, or they're just a little worked up, or maybe nervous, they're in the yellow zone, or they're mad or upset and they're in the red zone. If folks are in the red zone, that means they've been given a burst of adrenaline, and it takes about, well, I would say at least 20 to 30 minutes for adrenaline to be reabsorbed into the bloodstream. So when folks are red, including kids, that is a function of time and space that's going to allow them to go from red to green. And we really need to respect that and recognize that when people are worked up to that degree, continuing to go after a particular issue is not likely to be very successful. So giving folks the space they need. If you find yourself in blue or in yellow, the easiest way to get to green from there is to physically get up and move. And some of you, I believe, there were several people at the beginning in the poll said that they were working or were educators or working in an educational setting. I can't emphasize enough the literature on education and emergencies and about how to get kids' brains to be able to attend and then retain new information when they are under such degrees of stress as they've been experiencing. And how to get from yellow and blue is about physical movement. So the more you can teach by getting kids out of the chair and getting their bodies moving, that's going to integrate the pieces of the brain that are necessary to attend to and then retain information and process things neurologically. So any physical movement, you can do everything from the alphabet to math. And again, at any age, high school kids can do the same stuff too. You just have to think differently about how to physically engage kids in learning when that's not typically really how we do things, right? Okay. Oh, sorry. Active listening, really quickly. Active listening is the probably most undervalued and important intervention that we have. It works particularly with adolescents, teenagers, and young adults. Well, people of all ages, but not super young ones. But it is always an effective technique to listen and engage with kids wherever they are, right? This is about not problem solving. This is about asking questions to try and more thoroughly understand what someone's experience is and not jump in to try and fix anything. It is particularly difficult to do active listening, I think, with teenagers, but it is also incredibly effective. I saw a meme that I actually took a picture of this morning that said, when a teenager asks you to watch a movie, you don't ask what time, you don't ask what movie, you say, you kind of slow play, sure, like low key, yeah, that's fine. And then you're really excited about it because teenagers will engage you with what they want to engage on their own time, right? And on their own schedule. So when that happens, it's okay to get really excited about it, but you kind of play it cool, right? And active listening is part of that. It's about being willing to listen and engage with kids whenever it works and to keep those doors open, but also not to problem solve. As much as you can separate expectations around behavior from the relationship and focus on deeply understanding someone as part of the relationship, it's going to be incredibly effective in terms of resilience and psychological health moving forward. It sometimes doesn't feel very concrete for us to do active listening, but it is incredibly helpful. And for colleagues too, not just for kids. Okay, so for family communication in general, keep in mind those zones of regulation. The more we can slow down and take a pause, the more likely our brains are going to be integrated in our response. For younger kids, I think honestly, one of the most important things parents can do and caregivers in general right now can do is model emotion regulation. It's okay to get upset in front of your kids. It is, completely normal. You cannot hold it together all the time. None of us can or have been able to do that this whole time. But if they can see you working on the struggle and figuring out how to manage it yourself, that is incredibly powerful modeling. Kids learn so many things by what they're shown, right? Not what they're told. And so if we model the struggle and we model the process, then that's incredibly helpful for them. The great question in the chat: how do you engage a youth who is in a constant state of low alertness? I think one of the questions would be to figure out if that's a baseline behavioral norm for them or if that's a change in behavior. Excuse me. Some kids are struggling with apathy right now the same way that adults are. It could be a symptom of depression. I would not want to say that just with one data point, but you'd want to determine that, right? Is this a symptom that goes with another cluster of behaviors, or is this just its own thing that's happening on a short basis? I would say for teenagers and youth and adolescents particularly, it is really important for caregivers, parents, and teachers to find out what the reinforcers are. Figure out what are the high preference activities. And we can use those. I don't want to use the word manipulate, but that's kind of what it is. It's figuring out what are the high preference activities and using behavioral reinforcement in order to motivate a little bit. If there's something else going on, like at a clinical level, then there are other options at that point. But a lot of that sort of apathy kind of behavior, maybe lethargy. I'm blanking on the word that we were just using in our breakout room. I don't know if that participant is still here or not. But just this sense of malaise generally is incredibly common right now. Another thing about family communication is that it's really important for us to give kids accurate and truthful information about what's going on. Usually when I give a spiel on communication, somebody will say, but you don't want to, if grandma dies, you don't want to harm the kid or traumatize them. Here's the thing with that though. Usually children's brains will make up a reason for why something happened, and it's almost always going to be worse than what the truth is, almost. So being truthful and giving accurate information and not hiding things from kids is really important for them to be able to developmentally process some of the losses that we've all experienced and the reality of the situation. So I really advocate for truthful, developmentally appropriate information sharing with kids. For teenagers, alliance is really, really key. Establishing on paper so that you can stay organized for yourself, a set of behavioral expectations. This is what's okay at home. This is what's not. And if the not things are happening, then there are very clear consequences. Again, on paper, right? Black and white, stick it on the fridge. And I know this is it's an ideal thing, but if you can separate the behavioral expectations from the relationship, it does become easier, especially in the long run. But then it allows you to not respond emotionally to the behavior stuff. They either do what they need to do or they don't. And if they don't, there's a consequence. And if they do, there's a reward, right? So it's a behavioral reinforcement sort of technique that is incredibly effective. And it also allows you to relate to them and communicate with them about other stuff that's going on and not just about did they make their bed or clean up their room, because those behavioral expectations are handled kind of in a separate bucket ideally. These are kind of aspirational, some of these things. It's also really important for parents not to, or caregivers not to move the goalposts. I hear this a lot in therapy. Adolescents and teenagers particularly complain because they do X, Y, and Z, and then parents change the goal. And that's not fair to kids. So especially right now, they need as much structure as they can with regard to that. Okay, I'm checking my time. I think we're going to be a little short on time, but I will move quickly. Some of these I already have mentioned. Any window is a good window. Clear expectations, shift what they have been before. So set them clearly, but shift them from what they used to be previously. So whatever ideals you may have held children to prior to a disaster, just be reasonable about adjusting those expectations for the current conditions. You can talk about goals. You can communicate again when it's convenient for them. There's lots of little takeaways, I think, that are helpful. Okay, or I hope. So these next few slides, I'm going to go quickly because they're about back to classroom considerations. I just want to mention from here that as much as we say self-care, and I told you I'm not a fan of self-care, the idea behind this is that working through this process and allowing yourself as a caregiver to figure out something that works for you is essential. This is not an optional thing. It's a long-term deciding how we want to move into reconstruction and recovery and what we want the new normal to be like, and trying to get our feet underneath us to establish how we want to be doing this. So there are no right and wrong ways to do it because it's going to be very different for different people. But the idea is that including how you take care of yourself in the plan for how this works, that's an essential component. Before we went through COVID, that was a nice little thing on the side that people did. And what I'm advocating now is that it needs to be essential. And that's also great for kids to see you do that. It's incredibly powerful social learning. Okay. In terms of anxiety about returning to school, a lot of kids are going to feel very excited and a lot of kids aren't. All I want to say about this slide is that you're likely to see manifestations physically. So stomach aches, upset, nausea, headaches. Those symptoms are real. The causes of them might not be, something medically wrong, but it can be a physical manifestation of a very real anxiety. it's just common. We call them the MUPs. It's medically unexplained physical symptoms, but it's very real. All the symptoms are real. You can rule out things by visiting a pediatrician or a primary care family doc. Stress is not the same thing as trauma, right? All trauma is stressful, but not all stress is traumatic. And all kids have been stressed in this pandemic, for sure. The antidote for anxiety is to gently and directly deal with the thing that causes anxiety. The more we avoid anything that causes us anxiety, the more it reinforces the neurological pathway that caused it. So we really want to encourage kids to safely and gently approach the situation that they are anxious about. Make a plan and gather a team. Work with the teacher, work with other folks in the, other mentors or coaches or other folks that can potentially help, and empower the child or the student to be the boss of their anxiety. Have them talk to you about what's going on, or at least ask the questions. Sometimes they aren't always going to share, and reinforce for them that the anxiety that they are experiencing is very real, but it is something they can learn how to control, right? It's not like the rain or the weather that happens to them. It's something that their body is producing, and as a result, their body can learn how to control it. There are a lot of good resources for this that you can find in terms of worksheets and activities and guides on Amazon or wherever online you can find that can walk you through this process if that's something you'd like a little bit more information about. Okay, come up with a plan, drive to school. This is part of the exposure to reduce anxiety. What you want to do is get the child's body or the student's body at any age, and including adults, to be able to be exposed to the thing that makes them anxious without triggering fight or flight and releasing adrenaline. So it's about staying calm as you slowly get sort of exposure and relationally comfortable with whatever the environmental circumstances are that are going on. These are just some steps. And I think Gabrielle mentioned earlier that we're happy to share the slides. So if you're curious about these steps in the plan, they will be available for you in the slide deck. Okay, another thing that's really key here as we move forward is just to, please be kind to yourselves. We owe it to ourselves and to our kids to adjust our expectations about what performance looks like. You have got to consider, I just advocate so strongly that we all cut ourselves some slack, and we all recognize that we, even on the days when things don't go well, that we're doing the best we can with the resources that we have available to us. We are living in a natural disaster. We are living through a large scale natural disaster that affects all of these aspects of our functioning, the social, political, economic, and certainly emotional and physical consequences as well. So we've got to include that thinking in our sense of performance expectations and success for us as caregivers and parents or teachers, as well as for our kids. I'm a professor at Seattle U. I have never been more flexible in terms of my expectations than I am now. Some kids, or students, I should say, some students are on top of things right now. They're feeling good. They've got a great social support system. They're not isolated. And some students are doing everything they can just to get out of bed and attend an online class. And completing an assignment on time is a very, very unlikely scenario. So we really need to appreciate effort and what that means, rather than a particular outcome that's the same for everybody in terms of performance success. I'm not saying to get rid of expectations. I'm saying that we just need to adjust them. Okay. Healthy boundaries. This is essential for all caregivers, and it is not something that most people do very well. I would encourage you to think about healthy boundaries as appropriate responsibility. This means taking responsibility for your own thoughts, your feelings, and behavior, and not letting other people own those. So you get to be responsible for your thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and they get to be responsible for theirs. One way to do this, if that's something that's a challenge for you, is to recognize that when someone has a good day, like when their things are going well for them, you don't take credit for that. Like, we don't go around taking credit for other people's good days. So why then, on the other side of the coin, do we take responsibility for when someone else has a bad day and we put that on our shoulders? It's about this balance of appropriate responsibility and credit for thoughts, feelings, and behaviors with students and children too, right? And modeling for them how to do that in a healthy way. So sharing responsibility, allowing kids to take responsibility for their own emotion regulation and struggling through that process, because that's not easy and that's not something that anybody is doing well right now. But to just model for them how to navigate the struggle, how to take a break, how to pause for a moment before we respond. Those are all ways to encourage healthy boundaries. Also, on a very concrete level, you got to have time off. You got to have time that you're not answering email, not answering, text messages or voicemails that is protected, that you're not on duty all the time. Even if that bucket of off duty and being unavailable isn't as big as you might like it to be, it has to be there somewhere, and different for everyone too. Gabrielle, I'm just realizing I probably just zipped past the second breakout room, but I think in the interest of time, I think that's okay. Is that going to work for you?
Sure, that's fine by us. It's your show. On with the show.
Okay. On with the show. Okay. This is the last content slide that I'm going to share, and then I would just encourage you to ask any questions if you have them. This is a slide that I designed in order to summarize sort of all of the key takeaways, right? So modeling resilience. Social learning is the most powerful way that folks pick things up, especially students and kids. They watch what we do and they do what they're shown. They don't do what they're told. We are notoriously bad at doing what we're told, right? Just as human beings. The ingredients of resilience are purpose, connection, adaptability, and hope. And hope is not the same thing as optimism, right? Hope is about realistic opportunity here, even in the face of challenge. So modeling your own struggle with this and your own work on it has an incredibly great domino effect. The second thing is to engage in active listening. Meet them where they are, increase connection, ask open-ended questions. How are things really going? And if they say fine, that's okay. You can ask again another day, and at some point they'll likely walk through that door. It might be when you least expect it, or in the car ride somewhere, but they will if they know that you're really interested in how they're doing. Develop healthy boundaries, your schedule, your physical space. Just recognize that the parameters you need for your life right now, and as we transition back to school, have to be different than what they've ever been before. Making those adjustments is hard, giving yourself grace for figuring it out, and just doing the best you can. The fourth one is to identify pieces of a plan. Just write a list. Is it a podcast? Is it a TV show? Is it a walking the dogs? Is it baking cookies? I don't know. Right? There's no wrong answers. Just write some things down that are anywhere between 2 minutes and 5 hours of things that make you feel really good, so that you have a go-to list when you have a bad day. And then the last one there that I've mentioned a couple times today is that we just owe it to ourselves and to all of the children and the people that we care for to shift our expectations about what performance success looks like. We need to rethink how valuable effort is, depending on the resources that are available to folks, and the different threats, to be frank, that different families and different members of our community are facing right now, because they are very different. And some kids are certainly facing a number of socio-political and economic threats that others are not. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, that disaster recovery process is going to look very different for different families as we move forward. So part of changing our expectations is to really reflect acknowledgement of that. Okay. There are 2 more pages of resources here that are available to you. We offer training. We offer a variety of other guidebooks or guidance documents. The Toolbox for Families is a good one. And we have another one that's coming out that's specifically about the transition to back to classroom school, but it will be available soon. Not quite yet out. And everything can be found on our behavioral health resources page for the DOH. So I'm going to stop there. If there are any questions, I have a few minutes to answer additional questions.
Thanks so much for your time, Dr. Mauseth. Looks like we have a question about engaging with youth who are in a constant state of low alertness.
I think I answered that one as I went.
Right.
It's about finding out what those high preference activities are and trying to use motivation, but it's also important to distinguish whether or not that's a symptom of a bigger clinical issue or if it's just a temporary behavior change. So engaging with pediatricians or family care docs to rule things out and make sure everything is okay is a great step.
Great. Well, I'm just going to take a moment to remind folks that we do have an evaluation. So please take a moment to do that once we've once we've wrapped up here, the link to that is going to be in the chat shortly. And your surveys are critical to our work. Our grant agency, SAMHSA, requests that we do these surveys. So keep the funding coming for trainings like this one. We really need you to do the survey. So that is our plea, to do the survey. Don't forget that you can connect with us various ways. We're on Facebook and Twitter. We have a newsletter that we send out roughly every month, and you can find all this and more on our website. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that you'll join us for another one of Dr. Mauseth's modules in about 2 weeks. She's going to present about grief and loss, I believe, in the pandemic. So check out our website, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on the social media channels, and we hope to connect with you soon. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been our pleasure to host you, and we hope we'll see you at another training shortly.